After Vietnam, the American military was at a low ebb. The Air Force looked inside itself and launched into a period of transformation. Old ideas were swept aside. The bitter lessons of Vietnam were analyzed. Revolutionary aircraft appeared, the best and most advanced in the world. Space became the new military frontier. The USAF emerged as a revitalized force, ready for the battles of the next millennium. I'm Walter Boyne, and this is the story of the United States Air Force. During the agony of Vietnam, there was no let-up in the Cold War. Soviet Union weapons technology progressed rapidly, and America struggled to retain the initiative. The lessons of Vietnam and Soviet pressure led to a revolution in the Air Force. The profound social effects of the Vietnam War struck hard at military personnel and their families. Men and women who had always been proud of their uniforms were now insulted on the street by those who had protested the war. It was a difficult time. The military, especially the Air Force, turned within itself to compensate, coiling like a giant spring to prepare for the next leap forward.
The next time we vowed that we were going to have near instant air superiority, that we were going to have an air superiority fighter equipped with weapons that made that combination so lethal that we would own the skies in days, not in weeks, not in months, but in days.
Curtis LeMay was the most influential Air Force leader of the post-war period. LeMay had instilled discipline and established a highly structured, centralized management. Central bureaucratic control had made the Strategic Air Command the most powerful military force in the world. But it was time for a change. One of the major forces behind this revolution was General Wilbur Bill Creech.
It meant a total approach to putting quality in every aspect of management. That's quality in how you maintain equipment and provide tools and provide supplies, and quality in the way you treat people and their quality of life and so forth. It best described, from my point of view, what this new change was, this new very decentralized way, and these new and different core values.
Creech was a fighter pilot in Korea and Vietnam. He was a member of the Thunderbirds and Skyblazers aerobatic teams. He knew the meaning and the value of teamwork. He was obsessed with quality and productivity. Whenever he won a promotion or a new post, he pursued these principles relentlessly. When he was appointed to head the Tactical Air Command, he confronted a staggering task.
We didn't have enough equipment if you gave everybody what they're authorized for 4 squadrons. And then there were 2 squadrons coming online that we were supposed to put on, so I took 6 squadrons temporarily offline until we got more assets. That new robusting, I called it, versus sharing shortages, was far more efficient, flew more flying hours, and morale shot up, and so forth. You know, President Eisenhower was fond of saying, it's not the size of the dog in the fight, it's the size of the fight in the dog, and we shouldn't forget that. We gave far more authority down below to the NCOs, young officers, and so forth. We organized by teams and gave them a product mindset. We gave them goals, and we gave reward and recognition for meeting the goals.
By the middle 80s, the whole Air Force was adopting Creech's revolutionary management principles. One byproduct of this revolution was a change in quality of life for Air Force personnel. There were other changes, too. Since the immediate post-war years, the USAF had been fully racially integrated. Now the immense resource of talent provided by women, was also being tapped. Total quality management gave Air Force personnel a better life, more nearly comparable in pay, benefits, and prestige to civilians. The Air Force also offered the opportunity to obtain far greater responsibility at a much younger age than could be found in civilian life. And it offered a variety of options for continuing education and professional development. The Air Force Academy was established in 1954. It made a profound impression on Air Force standards. It has also contributed greatly to training theory. In studies of fighter pilots in 4 wars, one statistic stands out. A pilot's chance of survival goes up dramatically after his 5th mission. In the Vietnam War, something else became clear. The chances of surviving those 5 missions and inflicting damage on the enemy will go up dramatically if training is made very realistic. The kill ratio achieved in Vietnam was much lower than that achieved in Korea.
So as a result of those sad experiences, many of us came back and began to fight for a lot of the training that we have now. We were able to start dissimilar training, the aggressor program, Red Flag.
Unlike the Navy's Top Gun, Red Flag was not simply a dogfighting exercise. It was conceived as a mini-war game using composite forces. The training carefully mimicked possible conflicts in Europe and the Middle East and lasted 6 weeks. A first-line fighter squadron was the core unit. It could have representatives from as many as 19 other squadrons, each participating for 2 weeks. Each aircraft carried an electronic pod, looking much like a blunted missile. The pod would transmit flight data, position, speed, altitude, for both real-time display and to be recorded for playback. Arguments between pilots as to who won or lost a dogfight were settled by close analysis. Air combat maneuvering instrumentation displayed what happened in the air. The flying in Red Flag was very close to combat. The only things lacking were actual bullets and missiles being fired. Aircraft and crew members were pushed to the very limit of their capabilities, with no quarter asked or given. There were no excuses or assumptions in Red Flag. The aircrew members who went there were already well-trained, proficient, and well-motivated. Red Flag was the polishing process that took them beyond routine combat into a world in which the war plan is seen as a whole. The hard, risky engagements were carefully analyzed, and the combatants lived to talk about them afterward. During the long agony of the Vietnam War, the USAF had to maintain the nuclear deterrent of its bomber and missile forces.
I remember during my time as SAC commander, we watched every missile launch. And I remember one time we saw 2 missile launches in rapid sequence come out of operational areas in the Soviet Union, headed our way. I didn't know what was behind 2 missiles. Boy, that gets your attention real quick. And you know, we went to full alert, cruise in the cockpit, engines going. And I think that was prudent. But that's the kind of tension you lived under.
The Air Force had to continue spending a significant portion of its budget on research and development. This was necessary to match skyrocketing expenditure by the Soviet Union, which achieved one spectacular goal after another. In today's strange mixture of euphoria and uncertainty following the end of the Cold War and the dissolution of communism, it is difficult to remember the magnitude of the threat of the Soviet Union and its allies at the end of the Vietnam War.
The Cold War was very real to me, and I think to most people in my generation who were aware of what you had. You had a situation where you had two armed camps, completely armed with everything modern that technology could develop, and nuclear weapons and delivery vehicles by the hundreds, and you had them armed and on alert and in direct confrontation. And thank God, both sides were responsible enough not to trigger off an incident that would escalate quickly.
In 1973, the USSR, with 3.5 million men and women under arms, had 1,500 ICBMs, 600 submarine-launched missiles, and 600 intermediate-range missiles. The Soviet Union's long-range Air Force, the equivalent of the Strategic Air Command, had 700 medium-range and 140 long-range bombers. Its ground forces were backed up by 4,500 tactical aircraft, almost 3,000 interceptors in its air defense, and 6,000 more aircraft in the Soviet Navy. "64 anti-ballistic missile launchers ringed Moscow. The careful preparation of an elaborate civil defense system indicated a willingness to take losses. The country was defended by more than 10,000 surface-to-air missiles, backed up by the most extensive anti-aircraft and radar systems in history. The Warsaw Pact nations greatly outnumbered NATO forces in manpower and equipment, particularly tanks. There was nothing to indicate that these vast forces were anything but well-trained, well-equipped, and well-motivated. The memories of Khrushchev's warnings still echoed in American ears, from brandishing the Soviet ICBM capability to his shoe-pounding escapade at the UN to his boast, "We will bury you." America had no doubt that the threats were real. Soviet fighters poured off the assembly line in bewildering variety and number. Bomber production increased with the modernized Tupolev backfire and Blackjack bombers. Even more frightening was the deployment of the Soviet SS-17, SS-18, and SS-19 missiles. They had unprecedented accuracy and power to execute the USSR's acknowledged first strike strategy.
The Soviets had a great intercontinental ballistic missile force. And later missiles had magnificent hardening, better than ours. They had accuracy better than ours. We tried to tell people that, but the typical American can't understand anything being better than his. How could they have accuracy better than ours? We have the best technological skills and so forth. Well, they have great technological skills too, and they work at it.
There was an intensification of pilot training that moved away from traditional Soviet dependence on ground control. The USAF had to address these tough challenges, and some that were even more exotic. During the 70s, strategic arms limitation talks sought a rough nuclear balance with the Soviet Union. Maintaining this balance required that a great deal of USAF research and development expenditure would go to far more esoteric areas than in the past. The most demanding was in command, control, and communication. These new elements were difficult to defend in a budget, Many were top secret, and their benefits would not be visible to the public or Congress for decades. The electronic revolution was changing the Air Force as not even jet or rocket engines had. Beginning in the late 1950s, the Cold War spurred electronic technology far faster than hot wars had in the past, with dramatic effect on future developments. The revolution was spread out among several hundred programs that included the general development of computers and software. It also included the systems for electronic countermeasures, radar, command and control, satellites, navigation, and landing. Electronics was to become both the sword and the shield of the American military. An entirely new class of personnel was needed, with minds able to work in the abstract on the great ideas of the future. A special organization, the Electronic Systems Division, ESD, was established. Its job was to recruit, train, and exploit the ideas of such individuals. There was no quick way to procure a single electronic system. Any system had broad and deep relationships with other systems. The entire architecture of electronic warfare had to be developed at the same time. Rapid changes and advances in one system had to be integrated with all the others. This placed intellectual demands on the planners, even greater than the demands they placed on the budget. The process was agonizingly long-term. Some projects required 5 or 10 years to come to fruition. All that time, they consumed dollars and manpower. Not all were successful. In some cases, the threat changed or disappeared. In others, it was simply not possible to achieve all that was desired. The electronics revolution was complemented by a number of remarkable aircraft. Two of the most remarkable came from the famous Lockheed Skunk Works, where Kelly Johnson led the most innovative team in aviation history. The U-2 made its first flight in August 1955. It gained its greatest fame, or notoriety, on May 1st, 1960. A U-2 piloted by Gary Powers was shot down by a fusillade of surface-to-air missiles over the Soviet Union. This gave Premier Nikita Khrushchev the opportunity to savage President Eisenhower at the Paris summit meeting. The meeting collapsed. The U-2 incident also signaled the end of the era of high-altitude intrusion by bombers. They were no longer safe from Soviet missiles. The U-2 continued to serve for many years. It flew missions over virtually every square inch of the Earth's surface. A U-2 uncovered the missile sites being built in Cuba in 1962. The U-2 was created from the mating of a modified Lockheed F-104 fuselage to a slender wing of great span. This high aspect ratio, the relationship of wing length to width, helped the U-2 fly at great altitudes and for long distances. It was continually improved over the years with new cameras and highly classified new electronic gear. Today, the U-2 continues in service in modified form. While the U-2 was a gentle, almost ladylike airplane, the Lockheed SR-71 was a raging bull. First flown in 1964, the beautiful Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird is still the fastest and highest flying operational aircraft in the world. With its 2,000-mile-an-hour speed and 85,000-foot service ceiling, it's a real tribute to the design genius of Kelly Johnson and to the Lockheed Skunk Works. This particular SR-71 flew the first operational sortie with Major Jerome O'Malley at the controls. The SR-71 was a tremendous leap forward in performance. It combined the altitude and range capability of the U-2 with a blistering sustained cruise speed more than 3 times the speed of sound. The first version was called the A-12. Its maiden flight took place on April 26, 1959. The SR-71 was affectionately called the Blackbird, in tribute to its ebony color. Its 2,100 mile-per-hour speed and 80,000-foot altitude capability gave it immunity to interception. The USAF used it for global reconnaissance. It could be dispatched instantly to any potential trouble spot in the world on missions that might last from 2 to 10 hours. The SR-71 was extraordinarily flexible. It could go anywhere, from Antarctica to the heart of Africa. But annual operating costs of $300 million forced the USAF to retire the Blackbirds, at least temporarily. The U-2 and SR-71 were platforms for cameras and electronic surveillance gear. Most of it was classified. All of it was a product of the electronics revolution. That revolution still goes on in aircraft of more fantastic capability, whose existence is not acknowledged. In the years after the Vietnam War, there was a surge in the development of totally new designs and the modernization of older ones. These developments were driven by 2 factors. One was the deficiency in USAF aircraft and missiles that had been revealed by the Vietnam War. The other was the impressive series of new planes being produced by the Soviet Union. Among them was the MiG-25. Even before the Vietnam War had ended, the Air Force was anxious to create its own designs. It was embarrassed that 2 of its most recent procurements, the McDonnell Douglas F-4 and the Vought A-7, had originally been designed and built for the Navy. In the previous decade, the procurement climate had changed drastically. Costs had increased. The procurement process was intensely scrutinized by Congress, the media, and the public. Under Secretary of Defense McNamara's total procurement package, there was no fly-off competition. The airplane you bought from on-paper submissions was the airplane you got. This cumbersome procurement process caused development costs to balloon to as much as $3 billion. It was used for the last time on what was to become the standard USAF air superiority fighter, the F-15. A new fighter had been needed since the mid-1960s. There was a year-long paper competition between North American Rockwell, Fairchild Hiller, and McDonnell Douglas. McDonnell Douglas won. Their design became the F-15 Eagle. It was a design that responded to all the lessons learned so painfully in Vietnam.
I christen the Eagle, and may you reign supreme in your domain.
Hear, hear.
The Air Force came out of the war in South Vietnam knowing exactly what it wanted in an air superiority fighter. First and foremost was maneuverability. McDonnell Douglas obtained that in the F-15 with large wings and relatively low weight. It wanted speed, and this was provided by 2 huge 25,000-pound thrust engines fed through these cavernous intakes behind me. This power provided a great rate of climb, and this particular aircraft, the Streak Eagle, set 8 time-to-climb records, the last of which was to more than 98,000 feet in less than 3.5 minutes.
You got the impression flying the airplane that you really had good hands. Landing the airplane was a very smooth thing. Most of the time you could hardly tell you touched the ground. Air refueling behind the tanker was the same sort of thing. You pulled in behind the tanker, and it just sat there. And so you got the impression that, boy, I am really good. But if you ever watched the airplane from the outside, you'd see what was happening. You know, the ailerons were flopping around, and the elevator was flopping around. The controls were flopping all over the place. But you weren't doing it. The flight control computer was doing it.
It's so far advanced that it's getting to the point that it almost reaches the limit of the pilot's mental capacity to be able to handle everything that the modern day weapon system will do. Even though computers do so much more for us that we used to have to do ourselves, they also bring a capability to the weapon system that is difficult to comprehend.
The F-15 pilot has superb 360-degree visibility through the huge cockpit canopy. The Eagle took full advantage of the electronic revolution. It was designed to work closely with AWACS aircraft. It has the latest in pulse Doppler radar, inertial navigation, and heads-up display for instrumentation.
Two-ship left, 9 o'clock, burning.
The F-15 first flew on July 27, 1972. Unlike the F-4, it does not produce long trails of exhaust smoke to give its position away. It became operational with the 58th Tactical Fighter Wing on November 14, 1974. It has since become the backbone of the USAF fighter force. Even as the expensive F-15 was in development, there was pressure within the Pentagon for a lower-cost alternative fighter. The Fighter Underground was a small, independent group of Pentagon-based Air Force officers dedicated to the concept of a lightweight fighter. At first, their efforts were rebuffed as an intrusion on acquisition of the F-15.
So we were faced with having to modernize the entire fighter force. And while we had planned to buy 5 or 6 wings of A-10s, which are low cost, everything else was aimed at F-15. There was no way that you were going to modernize, at that time, 26 wings of airplanes with F-15s.
The procurement pendulum had swung, returning to the fly-before-buy concept that had served so well for so many years. The lightweight fighter the Underground promoted was perfect for seeing if fly-before-buy still worked. In the lightweight fighter competition, the General Dynamics YF-16 won over the Northrop YF-17. The YF-17 was then developed in cooperation with McDonnell Douglas into a Navy lightweight fighter, the FA-18 Hornet. By this time, the F-16 had overcome opposition within the Air Force staff. It was seen as a swing force fighter, meaning that it would be able to perform air-to-ground missions as well as its originally intended air-to-air role. The F-16 was selected as the standard fighter for Belgium, Denmark, Norway, and the Netherlands. It became the largest international military co-construction in history. It made its combat debut with Israel in the famous strike against the Osirak nuclear reactor near Baghdad, Iraq. The round-trip distance of 1,200 miles for that attack was accomplished without refueling. Later, the F-16 was used in combination with the F-15 with devastating effect in Israel's invasion of Lebanon in June 1982. Syrian fighters and 5 helicopters were shot down without any Israeli losses. It was an incredible victory ratio, a tribute to both the Eagle and the Fighting Falcon. In the 1940s and 50s, 6 new fighter systems were acquired in production quantities each decade. In the 1960s and 70s, only 2 systems were procured each decade. Now it looks as if only 1 fighter, the Lockheed F-22, will be procured for the rest of the century. Since World War II, larger aircraft have proved to have even greater longevity than fighters. There are 707s and B-52s flying long decades after they left the production line. The B-52 is probably the greatest example of extending the life of an aircraft design by updating its component system.
A lot of people used to say to me, well, why don't you go up there and tell them your airplanes are older than the pilots that fly them, and you need new this and new that. Why don't you make the case for the B-1 based upon the B-52 being worn out? And I said, I can't make that. I can't do that. I can't denigrate my own command's capability just in order to get something new.
In the past, modifications were created when something broke on a weapon system or some new requirement surfaced. Now, modifications are built into a system's master plan. They're installed through a phased improvement program. One, called Pacer Classic, saved the forced replacement of the entire fleet of Northrop T-38 trainers. Another example is the Boeing KC-135 tanker fleet. It will be able to operate well into the 21st century because of a $10 billion re-engining program. The alternative was a $30 billion procurement of new tankers. In a similar way, when the airlift fleet was found to be deficient in capacity in the Vietnam War, the workhorse Lockheed C-141 was brought in to have its fuselage lengthened by 23 feet. It was also modified with in-flight refueling capability. The modification was equivalent to obtaining 90 more C-141s at about 1/10 the cost. Modernization is expensive. It currently costs about $3.6 billion a year. But it saves roughly 3 times that amount by expanding the capability of existing weapon systems. It extends their service lives and avoids expensive new procurements. In the early 70s, the Department of Defense moved towards a total force concept. Part-time forces were to become more tightly integrated with the regular military. The USAF set about integrating the Air National Guard and the Air Force Reserve into the permanent force, so tightly that they would become the equivalent of frontline units. It would be one of the most significant changes in Air Force history, one that many people believed to be impossible. The part-time forces suffered from a poor image. In the 1950s, Air National Guard units were called Sunday soldiers or weekend warriors. They were looked down on by regular units. But by the early 70s, the Guard had been placed on a combat footing. Drill schedules were revolutionized. The Air Force provided the Guard with training as rigorous and as carefully evaluated as the training given its own units. By 1971, a collection of ragtag air forces, had been transformed into a fighting organization that made up almost 20% of USAF strength. The history of the United States Air Force Reserve has been filled with as many ups and downs as that of the Air National Guard. The Air Force regarded the reserves primarily as a manpower pool to be called upon in an emergency, but not expected to go immediately into battle. But when the Korean War broke out, 149,000 reservists were called to active duty, with some bitter controversy. There were complaints that reservists had been called to go to Korea while many regulars remained on duty within the United States. Reservists protested at having to fly war-weary B-29s in combat, while regulars were assigned more modern aircraft and stayed in the United States. But the invaluable service they rendered made a more extensive buildup of the reserve force inevitable in the following years. Over time, the reserves would fulfill almost every Air Force role with distinction. Through the 70s and 80s, the Air National Guard and the reserves combined with the regular Air Force in the total force concept. The Air National Guard and the reserves would make their greatest contribution to this concept during Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm. Their strength and ability hinged on the same stringent training and education that is characteristic of the regular Air Force. The 1980s began with a totally new approach to air power. The new Reagan administration gained congressional assent to pour massive amounts of funds into the largest American rearmament program in peacetime history. The Reagan administration was determined that the United States would in future conduct its relations with other states from a position of strength. There was another covert goal: to bring the 40-year-old arms race to an end by bankrupting the Soviet Union as it strained to match the U.S. buildup. One of the Air Force's first tasks under the new administration was to remove the stake President Jimmy Carter had driven into the heart of the Rockwell International B-1 program. What a magnificent aircraft. 150 feet long, 400,000 pounds, and a Mach 2.2 speed. This is the Rockwell B-1 bomber. To get that kind of performance, they had to fill it from tip to tail with technological advances that are still current today. Note the canard surfaces, still used on modern fighters and the supersonic transport. The blended wing and body, which houses the variable sweep wings. President Carter canceled production of the B-1 in 1977, opting instead for a cruise missile weapon system.
And there were a lot of people on the Hill that put a lot of pressure on us to fight the cancellation. Who are we to put ourselves above, a president that's been elected by the country, who has heard the story? So I wouldn't allow the Air Force to fight that decision on the cancellation of the B-1. I must say that made me quite controversial. And there were people that kept bringing back that I had failed to lead the Air Force in a fight against cancellation of the B-1.
I was very disappointed. I was disappointed at the reason, which I thought was a phony. I was disappointed at the staff, which supported him in the decision and didn't recognize the proper employment of long-range combat aircraft.
Well, the bombers were stabilizing because while they provided a devastating attack capability, that they could be recalled. Whereas once you launch a ballistic missile, it's gone. You can't get it back.
In 1981, President Reagan reversed Carter's decision. He authorized production of 100 B-1Bs as an interim bomber. work on the cruise missile was accelerated. So was the development of the super-secret stealth bomber, which in time would emerge as the Northrop B-2. The highly modified B-1B was the first new bomber to join the Strategic Air Command in more than 20 years. The B-1B had stealth characteristics. It had only 1% of the B-52's radar signature. With its terrain-following capability, it was a very potent penetrator. But it was plagued by stories of protracted development and by exaggerated reports of difficulties in testing. There were problems with the terrain-following software, but they were corrected early on. The major deficiency was the B-1B's electronic countermeasures suite. It has never performed as required. But despite this, the B-1B is known by its crews to be the best operational bomber in the world today. Its long gestation period has been justified. The Minuteman was a three-stage, solid propellant intercontinental missile. It began to enter SAC in 1962. By 1967, it had reached a force level of 1,000. Missile silos were built in remote locations. They offered instantaneous response to an enemy's first strike. Missiles also offered new challenges to Air Force personnel. These range from technical expertise to the psychological ability to adapt to life in a silo. Missile crews on alert had to be prepared to survive below ground level. The demands placed on families through stress and separation were equal to those long experienced by bomber crews on alert. Hundreds of officers used slack time to take correspondence courses. Cards were a last resort. Missile crews took pride in their work. They knew it was critically essential. Practice alerts happened with nerve-jarring frequency. The Air Force realized the need to maintain performance levels and morale in this difficult environment. Incentives were offered. Competitions, recognition, and awards gradually built a spirit among the missile force to equal that of bomber crews. The latest and most accurate American ICBM is the Peacekeeper. Taken together, the ICBMs, the air-launched cruise missiles, and the traditional bombers make up what the Air Force calls a triad for deterrence. Establishment of this triad was expensive and time-consuming, but ultimately successful. It created the enormous pool of physical and intellectual capabilities that brought about the Air Force domination of space through satellite-based military systems. The intercontinental ballistic missile did not replace the man bomber, but it did create a world of new requirements in research, recruitment, training, and career development. This became an essential springboard to the Air Force's establishing a supremacy in space power that exceeded its own aspirations. The reality of space power came almost silently on the scene. A major reason for this quiet approach was a series of international agreements outlawing weapons of mass destruction in space. Yet space is the ultimate high ground. It is essential for ballistic missile warning and for a multitude of satellite operations. Control of space is necessary to protect U.S. and Allied space-based systems. It can also, if necessary, neutralize any potential enemies' space systems. But the Air Force has never trumpeted space power. That would have been foolhardy. It would have run the risk of alienating the public and Congress. It was better to move quietly. Air Force space power was built gradually. While this happened, most public attention focused on a strategic triad of ICBMs, submarine launch missiles, and traditional bombers. Technology housed in the growing network of Air Force satellites increased the effectiveness of conventional air power manyfold. By the early 90s, space power would enable the United States to continue to deter aggression, even when so totally occupied with a situation as grave as the Persian Gulf War. And its contribution to the victory over Saddam Hussein's forces in the Gulf would be immense.